Well, I think there's no question that there is a lot of resistance to this agreement from Israel and even inside the United States. I think that Trump is getting hammered from a lot of his former supporters for agreeing to this deal. And he's terribly frustrated as a result, and he's lashing out at the Iranians. Furthermore, it's proving very difficult for him to get the Israelis to abandon southern Lebanon. And I think that's really the key issue, getting the Israelis out of southern Lebanon. And this frustrates Trump as well. And of course, from an Iranian perspective, it's absolutely essential that the Israelis leave southern Lebanon. So it looks like there are a lot of bumps in the road today. And I think the big question you have to ask yourself is what's going to happen moving forward. And my view is that Trump has no choice but to settle this conflict on the terms laid out in the Memorandum of Understanding. Mm-hmm. And if the Israelis resist, Trump will just have to steamroll them. He has no choice. There's no alternative here. There's no winning strategy that is an alternative, and maintaining the status quo would be a disaster. What I think is going on here is that lots of people do not understand that what's motivating Trump is the threat of a Great Depression, the threat that the international economy is going to go off a precipice. He has said that. He's talked about the possibility of, quote unquote, an economic catastrophe. He's made it very clear he does not want to be the second coming of Herbert Hoover. Yeah. Trump understands what's going on. And once you take into account those calculations, what alternative does he have but to lean really hard on the Israelis and to work with the Iranians to operationalize the Memorandum of Understanding? So I think eventually this is going to be, in large part, sorted out.
You give credit to Trump for at least recognizing the need to shut this conflict down, lest the global economy go off the cliff. He doesn't want to be like Herbert Hoover and triggering the Great Depression of the 1930s. I get that. But then what do you make of Trump's warning today? He said this on the Fox News program, that the United States could become, quote, the guardian angel of the Strait of Hormuz, even suggesting that America might one day assume responsibility for securing the waterway and collect tolls on the oil and the gas passing through it. John.
He's just bloviating. This is nonsense. We just fought a war and we couldn't take control of the strait. How is he now going to take control of the strait? This is just not going to happen. And furthermore, if he tries to take control of the strait, the war will escalate in ways that will expedite how fast we're moving toward the precipice. He would be insane to try to take the strait. So he's just blowing a lot of hot air today. And this is, vintage Trump. He's frustrated. He's getting hammered by the lobby and by Israel, as I said, and he doesn't like to admit the fact that this is really a case of unconditional surrender. You remember he called early on for unconditional surrender, but what he didn't understand in the beginning was that it was be us, the United States, that surrendered unconditionally, not the Iranians. And he's frustrated by that. You can understand it. And in typical Trump fashion, he's lashing out. But the question you have to ask yourself again is, what alternative does he have to settling this conflict? Well, it is a sovereign state. But the fact is, it's heavily dependent on the United States for economic aid, military aid, and for diplomatic aid. And the United States is a far more powerful state than Israel to begin with. And when you marry that to all of the dependencies that the Israelis have on the United States, that tells you that we have enormous coercive leverage. And that means in a situation where you're heading toward the precipice where you may have a Great Depression, the United States will, in my opinion, use its coercive leverage to get the Israelis to behave. They won't be happy about that. That's understandable. But the basic facts of life in international politics are that great powers are capable of coercing smaller states when their national interests, their vital national interests, are at stake. And that's what's going on here. You know, Donald Trump, up until very recently, was the president who never challenged Israel. All sorts of people have been saying since he moved back into the White House in January 2025 that no president has been more accommodating of Israel than Donald Trump. And that was true. So the question you want to ask yourself, why has he done this 180-degree turn? Why is J.D. Vance, who is damaging his political future by being the point man for the Trump administration, willing to take on Israel, to criticize Israel in ways that were unthinkable a month ago? And the answer is that both Trump and Vance understand that we are heading toward the precipice, that they have no choice. So that, I think, is basically what's going on here. I think one very important point that we want to keep in mind has to do with the difference between the Israel lobbies and Israel's effect on the public discourse in the United States, and the effect of the lobby at the level of policy. And I think, as we've talked about on this show before, there's no question that Israel and the lobby have really lost the game when it comes to the public discourse. Criticism of Israel inside of the United States is widespread. It's been at the policy level where the lobby and Israel itself have continued to be so successful. So what you see happening here is a huge crack at the policy level. It's the first time we've seen that. But what that tells you is that if Trump and Vance are smart and they appeal in a sophisticated way to the public, they will be able to generate significant public support for the policies that they're pursuing that the Israelis and the lobby don't like. It's not like Trump and Vance will be putting forth a policy or a strategy for dealing with Israel that's not going to resonate with the public at large. All sorts of people in the public are going to understand exactly what's going on here. And again, if Trump and Vance are smart, they will generate, I think, significant public support inside the United States for what they're doing. I just want to come at it from a slightly different angle. In setting up the arrangements for this deal, the Iranians put the nuclear issue at the back end. The Americans wanted the nuclear issue up front. But the nuclear issue is of enormous importance. And as the negotiations go along, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for Trump to abandon the negotiations, not simply because of the economic consequences I was emphasizing before, but also because we have to get to the nuclear issue at some point. There has to be some new version of the JCPOA down the road. And I think that once you get to the sort of final negotiations where there are a number of economic issues on the table, like reparations, complete sanctions relief, the toll booth, and so forth and so on, the nuclear issue will be folded into those negotiations. And I think that you will be able to get an agreement. I didn't think this for a long time, but the more I think about it, I think you'll be able to get an agreement, because the imperative to get a nuclear agreement is so important. And the fact that it's so far down the road increases the likelihood quite significantly that you'll have agreement as you march toward the final negotiations. I think we could go a long way in that direction. And the reason is I just don't think we have any alternative. To repeat what Rita said, we lost the war. We lost the war, and continuing to have hostile relations, continuing to fight with Iran is going to have disastrous economic consequences. What's the alternative here? What are the hawks? What is the lobby talking about doing down the road? They want us to go back after Iran. They want us to renew the bombing campaign. This is a completely cockamamie idea. We tried it. We lost. Face up to the facts. And it's much better to work out some sort of meaningful security arrangement between the United States and Iran. And by the way, as Trita was saying, between Iran and the 6 GCC states. Something has to be done there too. And by the way, I think from Israel's point of view, it's time for them to wake up and smell the coffee. The idea that they're going to finish Iran off and they're going to do away with Iran's nuclear enrichment capability is not going to happen. And it would make much more sense for them to create some sort of modus vivendi.
Do you think this has concentrated the minds of the Israeli public in the lead up to October's election? I mean, Netanyahu may well lose that election. Could this be a bellwether issue in that election, John?
I think it's too soon to tell, Tom. I mean, this is all just happening. I think even for all three of us, we're kind of in the dark and trying to figure out exactly what's going on. We have some, concrete opinions, but a lot of it's just tough to get your hands around. And I think for the average Israeli person, even for a lot of Israeli policymakers, they've been shocked by what happened. Remember, they believed that this was going to be a great victory. And the war only started on February 28th, and the realization that it's a catastrophic defeat for Israel and the United States didn't really come into play until probably a month ago. And I think it's just going to take time for them to understand what's going on. Now, you could make an argument they'll never understand because they're the Israelis, but I think the Israelis now have an appreciation of the missile threat that they didn't have before the war started. And that threat will only grow with the passage of time because everybody in the region will build lots of very accurate and deadly missiles. But the point I wanted to make is, if you think about where we were at on February 27th, I think almost everybody thought that Israel and the United States held most of the cards. I think even the Iranians thought that. I think they thought back to what happened in the 12-day war, the previous year, 2025, the various attacks on Iran by Israel in 2024. And they, I think, understood they were going to have to fight a war, but they didn't think they were holding that many cards. And we, of course, meaning the Israelis and the Americans, thought we held all the cards. And that's why Trump could talk about unconditional surrender. But as so often happens in wartime, as the conflict unfolded, it became clear to the Iranians that they were playing a very powerful hand in ways that I don't think, Trita would know better than I do, but in ways I don't think they anticipated. And we, meaning the Americans and the Israelis, certainly didn't anticipate. So you end up in this situation as the war is coming to a conclusion that is really completely at odds with what almost everybody, including the Iranians, and again, to go to the Gulf states as well, thought going into the fight. Well, I think that you hit the nail on the head when you talked about the alternative media. When you have an alternative media that reaches lots of people, it's very hard to smear someone like Trita because all sorts of people in that alternative universe rise up and defend him because they fully understand what's going on. And I think if you look at the number of views that a lot of these platforms get, I mean, Tucker Carlson, for example, Judge Napolitano, Danny Davis, and on, they get lots of views.
Mm.
And a lot of the mainstream commentators who have videos that are posted on the internet get very few views because people are not interested in listening to them anymore. It's like the New York Times. I know all sorts of people who tell me they just don't read the New York Times anymore.
Wow.
When I talk to my kids and their friends, and when I say my kids, they're in their 40s, right? They and their friends, they don't read the New York Times.
So what are you saying? You and I are dinosaurs for reading the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal every day, John?
No, because we have to be aware of what they're saying. I religiously read the Wall Street Journal every day, especially the op-ed page and the opinion page. And I, of course, disagree fundamentally with what those folks have to say, but I read it just to keep up with it. But I don't think that many Americans are attuned to what they're saying. And the problem is, Tom, that if you look at reality, if you look at what's going on in the real world, and then you listen to what they're saying, there's a real disjuncture there. It just doesn't make any sense. And I think that in this particular case, as Trita elucidated, worked to his advantage. Thank goodness.
Well, it's clear that the Ukrainians are going up the escalation ladder here. They're doing more and more to strike at the Russian homeland. And it's quite clear that in the early years of the war, they relied mainly on missiles, and they had a limited number of missiles, and the Europeans and the Americans tended to put significant limits on their use of those Western missiles against Mother Russia. But what's happened now is that the Ukrainians have turned to drones, and they've developed a significant drone force that has the ability to strike into Russia. I think at this point in time, the amount of damage that those drones can do is not that great. And it's certainly not going to affect the outcome of the war in any meaningful way. That's not going to happen. But I think the great danger moving forward here is that the Ukrainians, working with the Europeans, who remain determined to defeat Russia, will increase the number of strikes and the kind of strikes on Russia. I would imagine that the number of drone attacks will go up over time. And at some point, the Ukrainians, with help from the Europeans, will add missiles to the mix. And it'll be missile and drone attacks on Russia. And then the question you have to ask yourself is, what will the Russians do? And you've had Sergei Karaganov on your show. And Sergei Karaganov has said very clearly that he thinks that what should be done is that that Russia should strike at European targets to send a very clear signal to the Europeans that this is just unacceptable and this has to stop. And his view is that you start with conventional weapons, and if that doesn't work, you turn to nuclear weapons. Now, he points out, and I think this is very important, that when he first started broaching this idea of his in the early days of the war, he was in a distinct minority. Very few people agreed with him. But he argues now, and I take him at his word because he is an honest person, that the overwhelming majority of people that he talks to agree with him. The Russians, in a sense, are fed up, and they're tired of the war in general. And the idea that Ukraine is now escalating by hitting the homeland, the Russian homeland, more and more is just unacceptable. So something has to be done. So I think there's no question, Glenn, that if the war goes on and if Ukraine, working with the Europeans, continues to up the ante in terms of striking at Russia, striking at cities like Moscow, the Russians will retaliate along the lines that Karaganov is talking about. Well, when I think about the situation between Russia on one side and Ukraine and the Europeans on the other, it's not altogether unlike the war in Iran, the war between Iran on one side and the United States and the Israelis on the other side. Both sides in both conflicts are unwilling to make any meaningful concessions, and they just want to continue the fight. And you get to the point where some of the participants become desperate and they'll do whatever they think they can get away with to win the war. This is why we're worried about Trump attacking Iran this week, a subject I'm sure we'll get to in due course. We all understand that Trump is desperate, and when you're desperate, you sometimes roll the dice. Even when you think you're not going to win, you think there may be a sliver of a chance, but it's worth taking a risk. And if you look at the situation between the Ukrainians and the Europeans on one side and the Russians on the other side, there's just no room for negotiation here. There's no way that this war could be shut down diplomatically. So both sides are going to continue to fight. And the Russians are reaching a point where they're saying to themselves that this has to stop. And the idea that we're going to allow the Ukrainians and the Europeans to take us up the escalation ladder and launch massive attacks against Moscow with drones and missiles is just unacceptable. And we have to stop it. And if that means we have to pursue a really risky strategy, so be it. So I think you see that logic at play very clearly with regard to the Russian-Ukrainian war. And of course, the same logic applies on the Ukraine/European side of the equation. The Ukrainians are desperate to rescue the situation. They're desperate to keep the Europeans involved in the fight, and therefore they want to convince the Europeans that they can do things to the Russians that will turn the tide one way or another. So the Ukrainians have very powerful incentives to up the ante, and the Russians now have very powerful incentives to up the ante. The Europeans have powerful incentives to up the ante, and there's no bargaining space here. So this just tells you we're going to go up the escalation ladder, and as you and I both know, this is not going to have a happy ending. And if we go back to Iran, which I don't want to get into in any detail at this point in time, you can tell a similar story. So we're in deep trouble, both in the Middle East and in Ukraine. Well, I think if you look at the Ukraine conflict, the key to understanding why there's zero bargaining space is that from Russia's point of view, the Ukrainian and European positions represent an existential threat. And obviously, from Ukraine's point of view, and I think increasingly from Europe's point of view, Russia's position, Russia's success in Ukraine represents an existential threat. So you have two sides here, the Europeans and the Ukrainians on one side, and the Russians on the other side, who see this as a war between two sides that are determined to fight to the finish. And there's no room for bargaining here with an existential threat. And the end result is there's no bargaining space. Now, if you factor in the United States, in part because of geography, but also just because the United States is so powerful. And the United States also has incentives to have good relations with the Russians. We meaning the Americans, don't view the Russians as an existential threat. And that, of course, is why Trump is willing to bargain with the Russians. He's not adept at diplomacy. Don't misunderstand me. He's, ham-fisted in the extreme when it comes to doing diplomacy. But nevertheless, he's made it clear that he's willing to cut a deal with Putin. But the problem is Trump can't get to first base because the Europeans and the Ukrainians don't want to negotiate a deal along the lines that Trump is proposing with Russia. So there's just hardly any hope for diplomacy there. And of course, I think Trump in some ways has washed his hands of the Russia-Ukraine war because he understands that he can't get a deal, that this one has to be settled on the battlefield. So I think that's why you don't have any diplomatic space here.
Well, I guess the $1 million question, though, is would the U.S. enter a war with Russia? Because let's say the Russians launch a conventional strike on Estonia for allowing Ukraine to send its drones through its territory that is attacking the Baltic coast of Russia. How likely do you think it would be for the United States to join in or, well, do something significant if the Russians would do such a limited strike, not for conquering anything, but for essentially retaliating and restoring its deterrence?
That's very hard to say. I mean, if we go back to what Karaganov is talking about, he is talking about attacking NATO countries. Of course, at first, it's with conventional weapons. But if you attack a NATO country, at least in the past, that would almost guarantee that the United States would come in. It's not clear what Trump would do at this point in time, given all the trouble that we face in the Middle East. And here we're talking, of course, about the Iran war, but also if you get into a tit for tat with the Russians, and again, this is what Karaganov is proposing, tit for tat. Karaganov understands that, once you start attacking into Western Europe or Eastern Europe, that it's likely that you'll go up the escalation ladder, at least somewhat. So the question is, what does the United States think it can gain by playing tit for tat? And the answer is probably not much. And of course, this is why Karaganov is pushing this idea and why so many people buy into it. So it's not clear the Americans will respond, especially if the attack into Eastern Europe or Western Europe is limited. But who can say for sure? But you know what's happening here, Glenn? I think the Russians long ago concluded that the West and the Ukrainians, but especially the West, just does not respect red lines. That the West seems to have forgotten that we're dealing with great powers that have nuclear weapons. As you and I have talked about before, it's truly amazing that the United States and Britain aided Ukraine when it invaded the Russian homeland in the summer of 2024. This is the Kursk offensive. And of course, we then aided Ukraine when it attacked one leg of Russia's strategic nuclear triad. As you've heard me say before, this was unthinkable during the Cold War. The idea that we would help an ally invade the Soviet Union, that would never happen, or that we would help an ally or we ourselves would attack one leg of the strategic nuclear triad. This is just unthinkable. It was just so dangerous. But this is what's happened in the Russia-Ukraine war. And as we've also talked about, there's lots of evidence that Ukraine, with help from the United States and the British, was trying to take out Putin. And all of this makes it clear that the West and the Ukrainians, of course, are willing to behave in what I would describe as reckless ways. And the problem that the Russians face is that they did not respond in any meaningful way in the past when the West did those things. This is one of the reasons I think that Karaganov's argument now gets more traction. I think a lot of Russians understand that they would have been smarter to respond much more forcefully to these provocations that I just described early on. And by not responding, they have allowed the West and the Ukrainians to think that they can get away with striking at the Russian homeland. And of course, this is where we started. You were remarking about these large-scale attacks on Moscow. It's quite clear that the West and the Ukrainians are not deterred. And if anything, as you pointed out, it looks like we're going to go up the escalation ladder. So if you're playing Russia's hand, whether you like the Russians or not, but if you're playing their hand and you see what's happened in the past, you see what's happened over the weekend, and you listen to the Europeans talk, you listen to the Ukrainians talk, and you think about where this is headed, it's pretty obvious to me, and I'm sure to you, that the logical conclusion is that you're going to have to put your foot down, as my mother used to say, and you're going to have to send a very clear signal that this is just unacceptable. And if the West and the Ukrainians want to go up the escalation ladder, you'll go up the escalation ladder with them, and you'll make them pay a god-awful price in the end. So this is basically what's going on here from an escalation point of view. At the same time, you have no bargaining space. And as you know better than I do, this is a remarkably dangerous situation. What Karaganov is talking about is a huge step. I mean, even if you launched 3 missiles into Romania and 3 missiles into Poland, and you killed hardly anyone, and here we're talking about conventional missiles, that would be a huge step because it would be a Russian strike on 2 members of NATO. So the Russians don't have to do much to really ratchet things up. And I think that invariably that's what they're talking about. Now, let me just come at this from a slightly different angle. I did not think we would be at this point because I thought that the Russians would win on the battlefield. And the war would be pretty much settled by now on the battlefield. In my opinion, there's no question that the Russians are winning the war. And even if the war was stopped right now, the Russians have won. They have conquered roughly 20% of eastern Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are not going to recover that territory. And furthermore, if you look at what's happening on the battlefield, the Ukrainians are losing. The Russians are moving forward. But they're doing so at an incremental pace. And it's because of drones. I mean, drones, which were not manifestly apparent at the beginning of the war, are now manifestly apparent on the battlefield. And it makes it very difficult for the Russians to capture territory quickly and to, in effect, finish off the Ukrainians. I don't think the Ukrainians have enough troops to cover the front lines absent drones. If there were no drones, the front lines would be porous enough that the Russians could rather easily pour through. But given that we have lots of drones in the sky, the Ukrainians, with small numbers of troops, can hold the front lines and make it very difficult for the Russians to make progress. So I think there's no questions the Russians have won the war. And the only interesting question at this point is how much territory, additional territory, they'll end up taking. But the fact is, it's taking time. The Russians cannot count on winning a quick and decisive victory at this moment. And the end result is that there is pressure on the Russians to do something with regard to the ongoing air war that we started talking about. So I think given the slow progress the Russians are making on the battlefield, and given the fact that there is no bargaining space, and given the fact that the Europeans and the Ukrainians seem determined to increase the number and quality of the attacks on the Russian homeland, I think it's inevitable that you're going to get serious escalation. And as I said, it doesn't take a major step by the Russians in terms of number of missiles launched into NATO territory to represent a gigantic leap forward.
I'm still wondering if that message would be, I guess, received as intended in Europe, because it sounds more likely that when Russia finally retaliates, that the Europeans would essentially conclude, oh, look, we always told you that after Ukraine, Russia would also attack NATO. This is why we're helping Ukraine. So they wouldn't see it as a deterrent. They would just see it as Moscow's march towards Paris, essentially, something along those lines. I might be mistaken, of course, but
if I could just jump in, Glenn,
Yeah.
I think what you're missing is that in the background is the nuclear threat. We're not just talking about starting World War I or World War II, which would be absolutely horrible in its own sense, but we're talking about the fact that the Russians have nuclear weapons, and that Karaganov and others are talking about using those nuclear weapons. It's very important to understand that. So once you begin to go up the escalation ladder, everybody understands that at some point up there, it's hard to figure out, exactly where that point is. Your eyes are closed and you're feeling your way up the escalation ladder, right? But somewhere up that ladder is nuclear use. On one of the rungs is the use of nuclear weapons. And everybody, or almost everybody, is going to want to avoid that. This is what Karaganov understands. The mere threat of nuclear weapons will have huge deterrent value. And I think he's correct in that regard, because we don't want to get incinerated. And what Karaganov is talking about and others are talking about is, getting out on the slippery slope. And once you're out on the slippery slope, who knows how far you're going to slip. Right. Again, we're on the escalation ladder. You can't see for sure where you're going. Your eyes are closed, right? You're feeling your way around in the dark, and nuclear weapons may be used. So the argument here is that once you start up the escalation ladder, the incentives for everybody to put an end to it very quickly are very great. Just to start with Ukraine, there's no question that if you look at the narrative in the West at this point in time, it's that the Ukrainians are winning. They've turned the tide. The Russians are on their back feet, and so forth and so on. The great danger there, Glenn, is that gives the Europeans and the Ukrainians an incentive to increase the attacks on the Russian homeland. The argument that people are making is that we finally have the Russians on the run, that these attacks are devastatingly effective, and let's just, ramp up the number and quality of the attacks, and we'll do even better on the battlefield. If you believe that rhetoric, as we discussed before, you're asking for really big trouble.